0347 local time. The Strait of Hormuz, just east of Bandar Abbas. A U.S. Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, steaming at 12 knots through the inbound traffic lane, registers 15 fast-moving surface contacts breaking off the Iranian coastline at high speed. The signatures are small. Low radar cross-section. Erratic vectors. Within 90 seconds, the destroyer's Combat Information Center confirms what the bridge already suspects. 15 IRGC Navy fast attack craft, fanning into a classic swarm geometry, are closing the warship from 3 separate bearings at over 40 knots. The official version of what happened next, the version that surfaced in fragments through regional outlets and brief Pentagon statements, describes a tense standoff that de-escalated without weapons release. That version is accurate. It is also incomplete, because what unfolded in those 40 minutes inside the choke point was not a confrontation Tehran lost. It was an ambush Tehran chose to interrupt. And the reason it was interrupted has very little to do with the destroyer on the surface. The visible picture was clean. A single U.S. warship, surrounded, outnumbered 15-1 in hull count, navigating the narrowest stretch of the most strategically sensitive waterway on Earth. Regional commentators framed it as a demonstration of Iranian asymmetric power. The IRGC's preferred narrative wrote itself. The strait belonged to them. American naval presence could be hemmed in, harassed, and reminded of its exposure on demand. But behind that surface choreography sat a different question, one that intelligence officers in Manama and Tampa were already asking before the speedboats had even cleared the breakwater. Why 15? Why this destroyer? Why at this hour? Because IRGC swarm doctrine does not deploy at that scale for harassment. 15 craft is not a message. 15 craft is a strike package. To understand what was actually staged that night, you have to understand the architecture of the threat. The IRGC Navy operates a tiered fleet built specifically for the geometry of the strait. At the bottom layer, you have the pay cap and tier-class fast attack craft. 40 to 50 knots. Crew of 3, typically armed with twin 324mm torpedoes or short-range anti-ship missiles, like the Nasser 1, with a reach of roughly 35 kilometers. Above that, you have the Zolfagar and newer Shura-class boats, faster, slightly larger, carrying heavier missile loadouts and dedicated electronic warfare pods. Layer behind them, shore-based Gata-class midget submarines, mobile coastal batteries firing Nor and Kater anti-ship missiles with ranges between 200 and 300 kilometers, and a network above our 373 and HQ, 9 derivative air defense systems along the Bandar Abbas and Keshem corridors. The destroyer that night was an Arleigh Burke Flight IA 96 vertical launch cells, Aegis Baseline 9, Spy, 1D radar, 2 close-in weapon systems, a 5-inch deck gun, and embarked MH-60 are helicopters. On paper, it could destroy every visible threat in the strait within minutes. The problem is that the strait is not a paper environment. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest, is 33 kilometers wide. The shipping lanes themselves are barely 6 kilometers across in each direction, separated by a 2-kilometer buffer. A destroyer transiting that corridor at 12 knots is, for tactical purposes, locked into a predictable line. Maneuver room is measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. Engagement geometry collapses. A weapon system designed to defeat threats at 50, 80, 200 kilometers of standoff is suddenly being asked to fight at 3. And that is the equation the IRGC has spent 20 years refining. They do not need to defeat an Arleigh Burke. They need to force it into an engagement window where its advantages compress and theirs expand. 15 speedboats, spread across 3 bearings, moving at 40-plus knots, create a saturation problem. The destroyer's close-in weapon systems, the Phalanx CIWS, fire at a cyclic rate of 4,500 rounds per minute, but they engage sequentially. The 5-inch deck gun is precise but slow against multiple fast movers inside 5 kilometers. The CRM and Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles are effective, but magazine depth is finite. Run the math. If each speedboat carries a single Nasser, 1 or a torpedo, and even 3 of them survive long enough to launch from inside 10 kilometers, the probability of at least 1 weapon reaching the hull climbs sharply. That is the cost exchange equation Tehran built its entire naval doctrine around. A speedboat costs perhaps $200,000. A destroyer costs $2 billion. Sink one. Or even damage one badly enough to require towing through hostile waters, and the strategic shock dwarfs the operational loss. But here is where the visible structure of the ambush starts to crack open, because the destroyer was not alone. It was never alone. The visible layer was the warship in the corridor. The hidden layer sat 70 nautical miles to the southeast, inside the Gulf of Oman, where a carrier strike group had been operating in a deliberately ambiguous posture for the previous 9 days. 2 Aegis cruisers, a second destroyer, a Virginia-class submarine whose position was, by design, unknown to anyone outside a very small circle in Norfolk and Bahrain. Overhead, a constant rotation of P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft and at least one MQ, 4C Triton high-altitude surveillance drone, had been mapping the Iranian coastline's electromagnetic signature for over a week. The destroyer transiting the strait was not the spear. It was the bait inside a much larger sensor net. And the IRGC, for all the sophistication of its swarm doctrine, made one assumption that night that turned out to be wrong. They assumed the engagement geometry was theirs to set. The man who understood this best was the strike group commander, a rear admiral whose name doesn't matter for this analysis, but whose doctrine does. He had spent the previous 18 months war gaming exactly the scenario at the Naval War College. His central insight was simple. The IRGC's strength was compression. The U.S. strength was layering. If you could not prevent the compression, you had to ensure that the layers behind it were already active before the first speedboat cleared the coast, which is precisely what happened. At 03:49, 2 minutes after the initial radar contact, the destroyer's electronic warfare suite detected the targeting emissions of a coastal anti-ship missile battery near Bandar-e-Jask going active. That was the second layer of the ambush. The speedboats were not the primary weapon. They were the herders. Their job was to force the destroyer into a defensive posture, slow it, lock its maneuver options, and create a stationary target solution for the shore-based missiles. The Nor and Kater missiles flying from those batteries would not need to penetrate Aegis defenses from 200 kilometers out. They would arrive from 40 kilometers inside the destroyer's reaction window, while its CIWS systems were already saturated tracking the inner swarm. That was the real ambush. That was what Tehran hid. And that was the moment the hidden layer activated. At 03:51, an EA-18G Growler operating off the carrier would have been loitering in a holding pattern over the Gulf of Oman at 32,000 feet, pushed its jamming envelope westward across the strait. Within seconds, the targeting radars on the Iranian coastal batteries lost coherent track. The IRGC command network, which relies heavily on encrypted but bandwidth-limited tactical data links between shore command and the speedboat flotillas, experienced what one analyst later described as a complete picture collapse. They could see the destroyer with their own eyes. They could no longer see it with their weapons. Simultaneously, a flight of 2 F/A-18 Super Hornets, which had launched 20 minutes earlier on what regional spotters had logged as a routine training sortie, repositioned to a point 50 kilometers south of the strait, well within strike range of every coastal battery from Bandar Abbas to Jask. The Virginia-class submarine, whose position remains classified, was now within tomahawk range of every fixed IRGC command node in the southern coastal belt. That was the visible layer. But the real pressure sat underneath. Inside the destroyer's combat information center, the tactical action officer, a lieutenant commander with 2 prior Gulf deployments, watched the speedboat formation behavior change in real time. The 15 craft, which had been closing in a coordinated 3-axis attack geometry, began to break formation. Their command and control had been severed. Individual boat captains, no longer receiving targeting updates from shore, no longer confident that their missile cover was intact, were forced into autonomous decisions. The swarm doctrine depends entirely on synchronization. Without it, 15 speedboats are not a strike package. They are 15 exposed surface targets inside the kill envelope of a destroyer that now has all the time it needs. The IRGC made the only rational choice. The speedboats peeled off, returned to coastal patrol patterns, and the engagement window closed. Within 11 minutes, the destroyer was through the narrowest stretch of the strait. No weapons were released. No warning shots fired. The official record reflects a routine transit with elevated tension. The actual record, the one that sits in classified after-action reviews, reflects something much closer to a near-miss whose outcome was determined not by what was in the strait, but by what was waiting beyond it. And this is the part that matters strategically, because Tehran learned something that night, and Washington learned something too. What Tehran learned is that the swarm doctrine, the cornerstone of Iranian asymmetric naval strategy for 2 decades, has a single point of failure that cannot be hardened with more boats. The doctrine depends on uninterrupted command and control between shore-based fire direction and the surface flotilla. Sever that link, and the swarm becomes a collection of isolated targets. The IRGC has been investing heavily in mesh network tactical data links and autonomous targeting protocols precisely because they understand this vulnerability. But the gap between current capability and required capability remains significant, and every additional layer of autonomy they build into the system creates new exploitation surfaces for electronic warfare. What Washington learned is more uncomfortable. The destroyer survived because the layered architecture worked. The Growler was airborne. The submarine was in position. The strike fighters were within range. The carrier group was close enough to project pressure, but far enough to remain outside the ambush envelope. Every one of those elements had to be in place at the right moment, and they were. But that level of integrated posture is expensive, demanding, and not sustainable indefinitely. The Fifth Fleet operates with finite hulls, finite air wings, finite submarine availability. The IRGC operates inside its own coastline, with effectively unlimited refresh capacity, low unit cost, and the strategic patience to wait for a moment when the American layering is thinner than usual. That moment will come. Maintenance cycles, deployment gaps, competing crises in other theaters. The architecture that worked that night is not guaranteed to be intact the next night. That is the equation that changed, not the tactical outcome. The strategic exposure. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of global seaborne crude. A single successful strike on a U.S. warship inside that corridor would not just be a military event. It would be a market event, a diplomatic event, an escalation event whose downstream effects would reach every economy that depends on Gulf hydrocarbons. Tehran knows this. Washington knows this. And the deterrence balance that holds the strait open is not built on the visible warship. It is built on everything stacked behind that warship that Tehran cannot see, cannot fully map, and cannot reliably defeat. That is the layer the public version of the story missed. 15 speedboats against 1 destroyer was never the equation. The equation was 15 speedboats, plus coastal missile batteries, plus shore-based command and control, against 1 destroyer, plus a carrier group, plus a submarine, plus an airborne electronic warfare envelope, plus a strike fighter screen, plus the entire intelligence apparatus that had been quietly mapping the ambush for 9 days before it materialized. The ambush Tehran hit was real. The reason it failed was hidden too. And the deeper question, the one that sits unresolved in every classified review that night, is whether the next attempt will come at a moment when the hidden layer is somewhere else. Because deterrence in the strait does not rest on the warship you can see. It rests on the architecture you cannot. And architectures, no matter how sophisticated, have windows. The IRGC has been studying those windows for 20 years. They will keep studying them. And one night, the geometry will look different. Not because the doctrine changed, because the timing did. What matters in Hormuz is not what is already on the surface. It is what arrives next, and what is already there waiting, beneath the visible layer, in the silence between the radar returns. If this kind of strategic breakdown is what you came here for, consider subscribing for more. The next analysis goes deeper into the hidden architecture, shaping the conflicts that haven't happened yet.